Hello, hello everyone. My name is Henry Gao. I'm a professor of law at Singapore Management University and one of the co-authors of the International Trade Law Casebook. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Hamid Mamdouh, who is currently Senior Counsel at King & Spalding's Geneva office and a visiting professor at Queen Mary, University of London. Hamid was my boss 20 years ago when he was the director of the Trading Services Division, a position he held from 2001 to 2017. In addition to being a very nice boss, Hamid is one of the world's leading experts on trading services. He has been the secretary of the WTO's Council for Trading Services since the establishment of the WTO in 1995 and played a key role in the negotiation of the GATT, both as a member of the GATT Secretariat since 1990 and as a member of the Egyptian delegation to the GATT before that. So today, I'm very fortunate to be able to tap into Hamid's vast knowledge on trading services and the GATT to help us understand some of the most difficult questions for students when they study trading services. That is, how to rate and draft services schedule. So Hamid, I will start with this question. Can you explain how to read a typical GATT schedule?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Henry, for this kind invitation. You know how close to my heart this subject is. And also, you know how a pleasure it is to be with you. We worked together for many years, which I still have very fond memories of. To understand fully how to read a schedule and how to draft a schedule, we need to, I think, place it in the broader context of the agreement and the purpose of the schedule, what the schedules are actually designed to do. The GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, is an agreement about liberalizing trade and services within a set of legally enforceable and legally binding rules. So the schedules of commitments play an important role, as I will explain in a minute, in codifying the commitments of different members in a contractual format. Now, the objective of the GATS is the progressive liberalization of trade and services. Progressive means you don't liberalize all at once. You liberalize progressively. Now, we can unpack that concept with a lot of discussions, but the basic point here that concerns us when it comes to scheduling is that if you're going to liberalize some and not liberalize all, or liberalize bits and pieces across a period of time, then you need a legal registry of what is being liberalized in legally enforceable format. Now, the other point here to keep in mind also is that the liberalization, the concept of liberalization itself under the GATS does not mean deregulation. The concept of liberalization means that members or each member would commit not to use specific types of measures to restrict trade and services. And that brings us to the legal nature of the commitments, which are under market access and national treatment. They're mainly commitments about what not to do, not so much about what to do, but what not to do. Now, that brings us to the legal definitions that will be used in drafting schedules. Now, there is also one very important element here, Henry, about the design of schedules and the design of the GATS as a treaty, which is the diversity of WTO members. Today, you have 164 members of the WTO at very, very different levels of commitments and very different capacities to undertake and implement liberalization commitments. Now, one important element that was discussed heavily during the years of the drafting of the GATS was how to treat developing countries in a fair way, how to make the agreement most helpful to the process of economic growth and development for developing countries and least developed countries. And at the time, the concept of special and differential treatment as originally designed under the GATT in the early 60s seemed to be not very helpful because it treats developing countries all on a one-size-fits-all basis. So it's one set of flexibilities that apply to all developing countries as if they were a homogeneous group of countries. Now, during the drafting of the GATS, that element was very important in informing the overall architecture of the agreement. Why? Because even then, the diversity among developing countries was very clear. So the traditional approach to special and differential treatment, which treats developing countries on a one-size-fits-all, was clearly not workable. And that actually informed the overall architecture of the agreement. We had to find a way in which different countries would undertake different commitments in a very customized way, not only suitable in terms of the levels of commitments, but also suitable in terms of which sectors to liberalize and at what pace and in what sequence. So that led to the kind of creative thinking which produced this format of scheduling of commitments, which allows for that kind of customized negotiated outcomes. And here, of course, the challenge that this format and technique of scheduling commitments was able to undertake was to reconcile two important considerations. On the one hand, you would want legally enforceable, clearly defined commitments. On the other hand, you would want a flexible architecture which would allow for the customized outcomes that would accommodate this huge diversity among members in terms of levels of development and capacity. So, as you put on the screen, Henry, this is what we ended up with. We ended up with this table. It's the schedule is in tabular format. And the way you read the schedule, I would suggest you start with the first column and then you move forward. So you start with the sector subsector column. And here, what needs to be introduced is a clear description of the sector that is being committed, or a subsector. And as you will see, and I'm sure you clarified that in your book as well, the reference to sector, subsector here is a reference to any level of disaggregation at which the commitment may be undertaken. You may undertake a commitment in a group of sectors, like all professional services. You may undertake a commitment in a subsector or one of the sectors, like legal services, or a subsector of legal services, which is legal advice and consultation. It's up to the negotiating parties to determine the level of disaggregation. So this is the first step. You look at the sector subsector column and you introduce a definition of what scope, what sectoral scope you're committing. Now here, if I may add something, you have to be clear about what classification system you follow, because in the GATS, there is no legal obligation to follow a particular classification system, but there is an obligation to try to make legally clear the definition of what you're covering. Now, we have been guided by the CPC, the Central Product Classification System in the WTO. And of course, the CPC is being revised as we go forward to accommodate, evolutions in different types of products. But one point here I would like everyone to keep in mind is that the GATS and the schedules treat services as products, not as activities and not as industries, as products. And that's why in the CPC, you will find the definition of each and every product. So you achieve the clarity you want to achieve with respect to the sectoral scope of your commitment in the sector subsector column. And then you move on to limitations on market access. And when it comes to market access and national treatment, you do have Articles 16 and 17, as you've explained in your book, which define the legal standards of treatment in cases where you have undertaken full market access and national treatment commitments. So the legal definition of what a market access and a national treatment commitment means and what you would be contractually legally accountable for, that legal definition is in Article 16 and 17. So in Article 16, if you have a full market access commitment, you make a promise, a legally binding obligation, you're not going to introduce any of the 6 types of measures listed in Article 16. And you have explained that very well. In Article 17, however, the obligation, if you undertake a full national treatment commitment, your obligation would be not to introduce any measure that discriminates against foreign services and service suppliers in favor of domestic services and service suppliers. Now, you can see immediately that the legal construct of both articles is different. The scope of Article 16 is defined along the lines of 6 types of measures, while the scope of Article 17, national treatment, is defined just as wide as the scope of the GATS itself, which is measures affecting trade and services. So under Article 17, any measure that provides less favorable treatment to foreign services and service suppliers compared to their counterparts, like services and service suppliers of national origin, would be a violation of a full national treatment commitment. Now, having explained that, when you're drafting a schedule or when you're reading a schedule, what you should introduce in these 2 columns, or what you should read when you read those 2 columns, you will be reading limitations. You will not find a definition of what the obligation is that's found in the articles. But what you will find in the schedule would be limitations that would deviate from the legal standard that is established in either Article 16 or Article 17. And there are different ways of doing that. Now, those limitations are always listed in both columns along the lines of the 4 modes of supply. As you explained also, the definition of trade and services is the supply of services across the 4 modes of supply. Now, as I mentioned there, you have different legal constructs, but there is something here that I should mention, and I would ask you to go to the next slide, Henry, because the next slide is actually the legal basis for the drafting and reading of schedules. Article 20 provides us with what I call the legal basis for schedules. I mean, actually, what should be really included in the schedules, and what schedules do. Schedules, as it says here in Article 20, are your registry of the legally binding specific commitments. And by specific commitments here, in the architecture of the GATS, as Henry explained, you have specific commitments and general obligations. Specific commitments in Part 3 of the GATS are those commitments which apply only in sectors which you have listed in your schedule. So what Article 20 gives really is a list of what you should specify. What you should specify in relation to sectors or subsectors where you have undertaken commitments. So in those sectors you list in your schedule, you have to list the limitations on national market access, limitations on national treatment. And then that brings us to Article 18. You will see here that another variation of the legal constructs of the 3 articles in Part 3 of the GATS, unlike Articles 16 and 17, which contain a definition of the legal standard of the obligation that you're undertaking, Article 18 doesn't. Article 18 provides only a framework for negotiating new undertakings. Undertakings which are defined through future negotiations. And the scope of Article 18 is as wide as the scope of the GATS itself. Any measure you can negotiate undertakings with respect to any measure that affects trade and services, except the only part that is excluded from the scope of Article 18 is any measures that are covered by 16 and 17. And it was important to have that watertight exclusion, because measures subject to Article 16 and 17 are already governed by the legal standards and provisions established in those 2 articles. The objective of Article 18 is to address regulatory matters, not market access and national treatment limitations, but regulatory matters which do not relate to market access restrictions or national treatment inconsistent measures. And the examples that you find for commitments undertaken under Article 18 are very clearly demonstrated. You look at the reference paper on telecommunications, which covers obligations relating to regulatory principles in the telecommunications sector. Another example is the recent outcome of a reference paper on domestic regulation, which is currently subject to integration into the body of the GATS itself. So that's another variation that allows this kind of variable geometry in undertaking legally binding commitments under the GATS. Now, there is an element here which is important also when you're drafting a schedule or reading a schedule, is that we've seen the differences between Article 16, 17, and 18 now. But there is actually an overlap between 16 and 17. We talked about the watertight separation between 18 on the one hand and 16 and 17 on the other hand. But 16 and 17 market access and national treatment do overlap in the sense that the 6 types of restrictions under market access can also be subject to the disciplines of national treatment, because Article 16 covers those 6 types of market access restrictions, regardless of whether they're discriminatory or non-discriminatory within the meaning of Article 16. So paragraph 2 of Article 20, and this is what I draw your attention to, is basically making the statement, and this is purely a bookkeeping kind of device, which basically tells you if you have a measure that is inconsistent with both Article 16 and 17, then you schedule it under Article 16. So this is another guideline that you should keep in mind when you're either drafting or reading a schedule. that when you read a market access limitation, you would also think whether that is national treatment violation at the same time. It might be not, but the schedule should specify that. Now, having said that, let me just address one point that is very popular among trade negotiators and services negotiators and scholars, and which is the difference between a positive list and a negative list approach to scheduling. I find this interesting because my response immediately is that the difference in reality, we need to distinguish between the difference of a scheduling methodology on the one hand and the level of ambition of liberalization in an agreement on the other hand. Because normally a negative list approach is associated with agreements that achieve deeper levels of liberalization, right? Why? Because of two reasons. The first is that if you're liberalizing a lot more than what you're not liberalizing, then it's a lot easier to list what you're not liberalizing, right? You have 11 categories of sectors and subsectors. If you're liberalizing 10 out of the 11, then you might just list the category that you're not liberalizing, and that would be a lot easier. But that's only a bookkeeping difference, because you can, even in that level of ambition, you can list positively the sectors that you're liberalizing and end up exactly in the same place with respect to what you're legally committed to. So the negative listing or the positive listing is in itself, I'll come to the other aspects in a minute, in itself is a bookkeeping difference. But what makes a substantive difference is sometimes the association of a negative listing approach with other substantive elements, other additional substantive elements that parties to an agreement would commit themselves to, such as a commitment to future services, that future services would be automatically liberalized. A commitment that any kind of liberalization would be immediately ratcheted in. In other words, what would they call a ratchet provision? You see, these are substantive differences that are not intrinsic to the bookkeeping technique of positive versus negative listing. They're associated with it because they go in the same direction of further liberalization. But such substantive elements are not in themselves an intrinsic part of a negative list approach. They accompany negative list approach agreements. But if you adopt a negative list approach, you do not thereby automatically adopt a ratchet provision or a commitment on future services. These are separate provisions. Now, you also have to keep in mind an important element, a legal fact with respect to schedules, whether you schedule positively or negatively. Schedules are about what you commit to provide by way of treatment. In other words, in all agreements, be it the GATS or any other agreements, your commitment is to provide treatment no less favorable than what's in your schedule. You can always provide a treatment more favorable. You could always do that, but you cannot provide treatment less favorable. Now, what does that mean? It means that what you write in your schedule is what you're committed to, regardless of what your regulatory situation in one time or another. right? You're writing what you are committed to legally going forward. That's an important point to keep in mind, because sometimes when you're drafting a schedule, you're looking at your regulation and you might want to provide a commitment that is not as liberal as what you have in your regulation. That's possible. You write in your contract what you're committed to. Now, whether what you write in your schedule reflects the status quo of your regulatory situation, or reflects even a more liberal or a less liberal situation, this is a matter of negotiation between the scheduling member and its negotiating partners. But what you end up with in your contract, in your schedule, is what you would be legally accountable to going forward. Now, the last point you would find in the article, of course, in Article 20, is that the schedules are an integral part of the GATS. They are legal provisions of the same legal status as the GATS. Having said that, you should also keep in mind that while schedules are an integral part of the GATS, but the rules, the legal rules and procedures for amending them are not the same as amending the articles of the GATS itself, or any articles of any agreement in the WTO. There is a specific provision designed to introduce modifications to your schedules. So, Henry, if we go to the next and final slide, we have Article 21, which basically says, and I'm not going to go into the details because there are detailed procedural steps that should be followed. But after 3 years from the entry into force of a commitment, any member of the WTO would be allowed to modify its schedule of commitments, but through negotiations. So you notify that you would like to modify or withdraw a commitment, and then you enter into negotiations with affected members of the WTO with a view to reaching a compensatory adjustment, which is, you say, I will pull out this commitment, but I will provide an alternative commitment of more or less equivalent value to interested members. Now, that's in a nutshell what I would say about how to read and how to draft schedules. But I would go back to you, Henry, and see whether there are other points in your mind that you would like me to clarify. So back to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Hamid. You did an excellent job of summarizing, how to read a schedule, highlighting the fact that the GATS schedule are structured in such a way to be referring to limitations, right, and qualifications rather than, the kind of liberalizations that you will making. So that is why, if you look at the schedule, actually the wording is very interesting because they use wording such as non and unbound. And when you are reading non, it should be read as no limitation, right? And we are reading unbound, it should mean not bound by any commitments. So that is very helpful, I think, for our students in understanding how to read a schedule. And also you did an excellent job of comparing the different approaches between the positive listing approach and negative listing approach, which has become very popular in recent years, especially because the US and EU and many other developed countries are also increasingly adopting the negative listing approach in their free trade agreements. So you also highlighted the differences very well. And I fully agree with you on this. Now, maybe to conclude, Hamid, maybe I would really appreciate if you could kind of elaborate on the factors that one should take into consideration when draft a service schedule, especially considering that many of our students might become government officials in the future, and in addition to reading the WQ schedules, they might need to draft the schedules themselves. So actually, for the factors that they should take into consideration when drafting a schedule, this is not so much mentioned in the guest itself, but you had such a vast experience of negotiating the guests and also helping the WQ members drafting their schedules over 2 decades. So I would really hope that if you can help to illustrate to our students what are the things that they need to keep in mind when they draft the schedules, be it a positive listing schedule or negative listing schedule.
Well, thank you, Henry. That's a very good point, and I should have covered it as well. First of all, I'll get to this point about drafting a schedule in a minute, but just to add on the positive versus negative listing, just a point of legal fact. If you look at Article 20 of the GATS, Article 20 does not exclude the possibility of following a negative listing approach under the GATS. It says in sectors, with respect to sectors where such commitments are undertaken. If you have a schedule which says all sectors except the following, you would follow a negative list. This sort of reversal of negative versus positive of listing of any limitations is something that can be done under any agreement. As a matter of fact, even under the GATS itself, you can see that when it comes to Mode 4, for example, the approach of scheduling is reversing the negative listing approach, because under each of the Articles 16 and 17, once you undertake a commitment, you start actually a negative listing of the deviations from 16 and 17 in a sort of a conceptual way. And these kind of approaches are reversible. Under Mode 4, they're not actually following the same approach. They reverse it. They say unbound, except for the following categories. So they do not follow the general approach of saying, okay, we're committed to full market access commitment across the 6 categories, except these limitations, which is conceptually a negative listing of limitations as opposed to an elaboration of positive commitments. So the point I'm making here, which is to keep in mind, is that there is nothing in Article 20 or in the GATS which would prevent members from adopting a negative list approach. This is actually, this draft here of Article 20, not draft, sorry, these provisions of Article 20 were the result of a drafting exercise that discussed the negative versus positive listing for almost a year during the Uruguay round. Now, back to your point, Henry, about what to take into account, you're right. The GATS itself in its provisions does not contain the adequate level of detail. And for that, I would refer everyone to a document which we call the Guidelines on the Scheduling of Commitments under the GATS. The symbol for that document is document S/L/92. We call them roughly the scheduling guidelines. And in that document, there is an elaborated explanation of when you're drafting a schedule, what do you schedule and how do you schedule? So it's an explanation of the what and the how. And what you schedule, it goes into detail about how you define the limitations. When you look at your regulations, how do you spot the measures that should be scheduled? How do you define the so-called restrictions on market access and national treatment, or what we call legally limitations? Now, to what extent you list them or to what extent you undertake to remove them, that's a matter of negotiations. But as a technical matter of scheduling, SL92 explains how you define those, how you spot them. And then it also explains how do you schedule them, including how do you deal with this situation of overlap between Articles 16 and 17, market access and national treatment? How do you go about it so that you schedule the measure in question in the right place under Article 16? And the scheduling guidelines contain examples as well that illustrate the methodology that should be approached. So these are very important things. But one advice that I would give to government officials or negotiators or anyone who will be involved in drafting a schedule is please do not take your guidance from existing schedules. Take your guidance from the scheduling guidelines. Because the scheduling guidelines, particularly in their current shape, they're adopted by the Services Council by consensus of all WTO members. So the scheduling guidelines represent how all WTO members read the provisions of the GATS and project them into scheduling techniques. And a lot of what's in current schedules have been negotiated during the Uruguay round. And schedules are negotiated outcomes. And sometimes the politics of negotiations blur a bit the legal lines that should be drawn. So that would be sort of an advice from an old man. Please don't take your guidance from existing schedules. Take your guidance from the scheduling the guidelines and related instruments and from the provisions of the GATS itself. I hope that helps, Henry. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Hamid, for reminding us that you should always refer to the scheduling guidelines, which we also discussed in the casebook. But I should add that in addition to rely on the schedule guidelines, you should also consult the true experts like Hamid, when you run into difficulties on how to draft your schedule. So I hope you find the explanation today by Hamid on how to read and draft the schedules and the difference between positive and negative listing schedules helpful. Again, thanks for using the textbook and thanks for watching this video. We'll have more videos coming up for the casebook. And until then, enjoy reading the casebook. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good luck.